All right, so today we're going to break down a really fascinating strategic analysis of a hypothetical U.S. military operation in Venezuela. On the surface, this thing looks like an absolute flawless victory. But according to the report we're digging into, it was actually a catastrophic blunder. So let's get into how a perfect mission can go so wrong.
The analysis we're exploring from the Conway report kicks off with this absolute bombshell of a line. I mean, wow. It sets up this huge mystery, right? How can a military mission that was executed perfectly become a strategic catastrophe? That is the big question we're going to unpack today.
So, who was the target of this hypothetical raid? None other than Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. Now, the official justification for the whole operation was framed as a simple law enforcement action, just to arrest a guy who's been indicted on narco-terrorism charges. Sounds pretty straightforward. And look, from a purely tactical point of view, the operation was an absolute masterpiece. The planning was just meticulous. You had CIA teams on the ground for months, elite Delta Force operators practicing on a full-scale replica of Maduro's compound, and oh yeah, the entire USS Gerald R. Ford carrier group just sitting in the Caribbean providing overwhelming force. The raid itself? It went off without a hitch. Maduro was captured and, get this, 0 American casualties. It was, in President Trump's own words, a spectacular success.
Which brings us right back to that core question. If the military side of things was so flawless, why does this analysis call it a blunder? Well, the answer, according to the report, has literally nothing to do with the raid itself, but everything, and I mean everything, to do with what happened in the hours and days right after.
So let's quickly recap the first part of this story, the spectacular military victory. I mean, on every tactical level you can imagine, the raid was a clear, undeniable win. But, as we're about to see, that's pretty much exactly where the clarity ends. And this leads us straight into what's known as the day after problem. This is that crucial moment where a tactical win starts to just completely unravel into a strategic nightmare, because apparently there was no real plan for what to do once Maduro was actually in custody. Now this is where it gets really telling. Just look at the insane contrast between the story coming from the White House and what was actually happening on the ground just 48 hours later. Trump claims the vice president is cooperating. In reality, she's on TV publicly demanding Maduro's release. He says America will run the country. Nope. The Venezuelan government was still up and running and actively resisting. That promise of a smooth, safe transition, it had already turned into a massive constitutional crisis back home with no clear way out. And this is the absolute core idea of the Conway report's analysis, what they call the trap thesis. The report argues that all this chaos, it wasn't an accident. It was the plan. See, Maduro's genius wasn't in trying to avoid getting caught. It was in making his own capture the trigger for a trap. A trap designed to bog the U.S. down in a crisis of its own making. And as the report is quick to point out, this kind of strategic failure, well, it isn't new. In fact, it follows a depressingly familiar pattern we've seen in recent American foreign policy, where we mistake short-term military wins for long-term political solutions. I mean, come on, think about Iraq in 2003, a super-fast, decisive military victory that toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, which was then followed by almost a decade of insurgency, sectarian war, and a costly, bloody quagmire. Why? Because there was no effective plan for what to do the day after. Or, hey, look at Libya in 2011. A successful NATO air campaign helps get rid of Gaddafi, only to leave this huge power vacuum that plunges the country into a brutal civil war, destabilizes the whole region, and becomes a playground for extremist groups. Another flawless military operation, another catastrophic political mess. And maybe the most powerful example of all is Afghanistan. After 20 years and $2 trillion spent trying to build a new government, it all came crashing down in just 11 days once U.S. forces left. It was the ultimate proof that a government propped up by foreign military power without any real local support is just a house of cards. And understanding this history is absolutely key to understanding the trap in Venezuela. Okay, so how exactly does this trap work? Well, the report describes Maduro's strategy as being asymmetric. He knew he couldn't win a straight-up military fight, so instead, he designed a plan to win the political, legal, and international battles that he knew would come next. The strategy really had 3 main parts. First, create a legal crisis for the president back in the United States. Second, fire up resistance inside Venezuela by making any cooperation with the U.S. an act of treason. And third,
isolate the U.S. on the world stage by painting the whole thing as old-school imperial aggression. This slide just lays out the legal trap so perfectly. Remember, the operation was first sold as a limited law enforcement action, which, importantly, doesn't require Congress to sign off on it. But, and this is the genius of the trap, Trump's own words after the raid, talking about running the country and seizing its oil, completely blew up that justification. He basically single-handedly turned it into an act of war, and that triggered a huge constitutional crisis over the War Powers Resolution, which hands his political opponents at home a massive weapon against him. Now, trying to govern a country you've just invaded is hard enough, right? But this chart shows you why it's pretty much impossible in Venezuela. Even though the opposition might be bigger, expert estimates figure that at least 20% of the population, a solid chunk, remains loyal to Maduro. We're talking millions of people who are hostile to an American presence from day one. That's not a nation-building project, that's a recipe for a quagmire. And that leads us to our final section, the quagmire. This is where we see all the cascading, awful consequences of walking right into Maduro's trap. This is where we watch a tactical victory just curdle into a strategic defeat that touches everything from domestic politics to international law. The key thing to understand here is that Maduro's strategy created a perfect catch-22. I mean, look at this. Option 1, try to govern Venezuela directly. What do you get? An expensive, endless quagmire with a high risk of American casualties. That's a political disaster. Okay, so what about option 2? Negotiate with what's left of Maduro's regime. Well, doing that legitimizes the very government you just tried to overthrow, and it gives them all the bargaining power. That's a strategic defeat. There are literally no good options left on the table. And the political fallout back home? Oh, as the report lays it out, it would be absolutely severe. An action like this would alienate his own base by breaking his huge promise to end endless wars. At the exact same time, it would totally unify the opposition around this powerful narrative of an illegal war for oil. Not to mention the constitutional crisis over war powers. From an electoral standpoint, it's a catastrophe. Every single outcome, quagmire, withdrawal, negotiation, just hands his opponents a devastating line of attack. And just to pile on top of all of this, there's this one single powerful number. According to a poll cited in this source, 70% of Americans were already against military action before the operation even started. So this action was taken not only without a real long-term strategy, but in direct defiance of what the public actually wanted. And so this entire incredible analysis brings us to this final, really provocative question. In a world where your enemy can flip your greatest military strength into a strategic weakness, where a perfect victory on the battlefield leads to a guaranteed political defeat, what does victory in modern conflict even mean anymore?